And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And it's really, really great to be back with you. Now, I just sent a link to William to join me. Um, Unfortunately, I didn't correspond with him today to let him know I was going to try to be on the program tonight. As most of you know, I've been out of pocket for about 3 weeks. Both my wife and I have been very, very ill. My wife was dangerously ill. As a matter of fact, we almost lost her. She came down with pneumonia. There's William Bell, so I'll let him in there. She came down with double pneumonia, with RSV, and with strep throat, all at the same time. And we just barely got her to the doctor in time. Now I just allowed William in, but I don't see him anywhere. Um, William, are you there anywhere? Huh. Well, that's another issues that I had. I don't know if it's related, but a week and a half ago, I had a huge power spike here at my office, and it actually damaged my laptop and it completely destroyed my monitor. My normal monitor is sitting on a table over here, completely inoperative. Thankfully, I had another monitor in the back in what we call our inventory room. So, pardon me. That's how I have a monitor tonight. I'm trying to get my camera aligned properly here. So, anyway, William, I cannot see you uh, or hear you if you are anywhere around. Huh. Video settings, meeting webinar recording. Folks, I apologize for this. I suspect that the power spike that I had has probably damaged my computer internally somehow. It spent, well, there's William trying to get on now. But I had my computer at the shop for 3 or 4 days trying to get it fixed, but they told me there's a possibility that I might have a little bit of a problem. So William is trying to log on right now. There you are. Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I can
All
hear
right.
you.
Very good. Well,
So
welcome
it's,
back.
oh, thank you so much. It is good to be back. My wife actually asked me earlier in the day because I was still feeling so bad. She said, "Are you going to try to do the show with William tonight?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to give it a shot. I don't know how things are going to go, but I've got my trusty, rusty little puffer here, and Jan and I both just can't seem to just get over that final hump, you know.
Hmm.
We're both experiencing just really, really severe lethargy. When I sit down in my easy chair, now part of this may be related to getting old, William. I don't know. I sit down in my easy chair and I'm gone. I'm asleep. And my wife said, "Well, you're just turning into your dad. That's all you can say about that." But boy, all I want to do is sleep. I pick up a book. I'm reading a fantastic book right now, trying to read it, and I'll read a couple of paragraphs, and I realize I don't have a clue what I just read.
Mm.
No comprehension, no retention, and I go back and read it and read it and read it, and finally some of it's soaking in. But it's an excellent book in many, many ways. It's over at the house right now, but it's reading Matthew as the climactic fulfillment of the Hebraic story. Now, just think about how suggestive that is.
Hmm.
And he really, really does a marvelous job. There are a few gaps in it as I personally as I view it. One of the major ones is he mentions Daniel chapter 7 as playing a key role in the Matthean story, right? And he even talks about how Matthew 7, or excuse me, uh, Daniel 7, 13 and 14 is the he calls Matthew chapter 28, 19, 18 through 20 the climactic conclusion of Daniel 7.
That's pretty neat.
It's very neat, but he misses the judgmental context,
Mm.
even though in several passages, you have to excuse me, I'm having lots of trouble with my eyes tonight, a hangover. He mentions Daniel 7 being in the context of several judgment passages, and he just says the context here is judgment. Now he doesn't say it's not the ascension, but he says the context is the judgment. And so he kind of creates a dichotomy between all of these Son of Man coming on the cloud of heaven texts from Daniel being judgment context to jumping to Matthew chapter 28, 18 to 20 as the consummative commentary on Daniel chapter 7. And
Mm.
you've got to go, well, what happened to all of your judgment context? And seeing the fact that Jesus had received all authority in heaven and in earth, meaning that he was about to come in judgment of that old covenant history. So he's got a few things like that that those of us who are preterists would look at it and go, oh, wait a minute, why didn't you connect the dots here?
Hmm.
It's only because he received the authority, the judgmental authority, that he was about to come in judgment of that old Hebraic covenant history in AD 70. So anyway,
Yeah, sounds like a neat book. And, I'm sitting here listening and I'm saying, okay, why can't he see that in Matthew if that's the direction that he's going, especially with all the emphasis in Matthew on, eschatological teachings, starting what, as early as chapter 20 or so?
chapter 10,
Well,
22 and
really,
23.
yeah, actually. So that's interesting.
Well, I've been writing it. I started the article well before I got sick, uh, but it's on Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14, trying to demonstrate that the text has nothing to do with the ascension. I mean, one might argue that the ascension is part of the end time drama. There's no question about that.
Hmm.
But Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14 is a judgment context. And so when I got sick, I started picking that book up and trying desperately to understand it as I was reading it. And I'd read two or three paragraphs, just toss it down like I don't know, I can't read. And then finally, just over the last week or so, so as I began reading that book and try and grasping a little bit, I'm going, wait a minute, you're mentioning Daniel 7 all these times. You're acknowledging judgment and what have you. And you're failing to see that Daniel 7, the allusions to Daniel chapter 7, begin at least in Matthew 10, 22 and 23. And all throughout the book, right down to chapter 28, every single instance of an allusion, a citation, an echo of Daniel chapter 7 is judgment context. So why didn't this brilliant scholar see how Matthew was weaving so beautifully, the entire narrative of Daniel chapter 7 into his story of the climax of Israel's covenant history? Why didn't he see this?
Yeah. I'm sitting here thinking, since you mentioned Matthew 10, my mind is going all the way back to chapter 1, with Christ coming in the last days and John the Baptist in chapter 3
Yes.
and in Matthew 5. I'm saying, wow, I can see exactly that direction.
Oh, the narrative flow of Matthew as the climax of Israel's covenant history, when you start looking at it, I think the fancy word these days is the meta narrative, the whole picture.
Yeah.
Once you start seeing Matthew 1 through 28 as Israel's story and her last days to bring in the everlasting covenant, everlasting new kingdom of Christ, boy, the unity of Matthew just jumps out at you in a magnificent, magnificent way. So anyway, William, it's great to be back. I want to thank you so very, very much for filling in. Uh, I haven't had a chance to even go back and to watch or to listen. I haven't done much of anything. I did manage to film three morning musings this week. Don't ask me what I said in those videos, but I did manage to film. It was a struggle, to be honest about it. But once again, I want to thank you so very, very much for filling in. I know you did a great, great job as always. You always do a wonderful job. So I want you to know how much I appreciate that.
Well, I'm just glad to see you back. So you're doing better and hope you don't overdo it, coming back and jumping back into everything that you got going on. So, that is a lot. And I know it puts a tremendous strain on your voice. So you got to
Jan,
get some rest. You got to take some care of it.
Jan's been preaching to me about not overdoing it.
Yeah.
So it is what it is. So, William, obviously, I wasn't with you. I know that you went back and you did cover some more of the parallels between Colossians and 1 Corinthians 15. If you wish to bring us up to speed on that, and then you can kind of launch us into a good subject for tonight.
I just about ran out of subjects. um, I did cover the rest of the material that we had on the comparisons between Colossians 1 and 1 Corinthians 15. And, I thought it was a real good study. I got good feedback on it, et cetera. And, everything just kind of flowed in place from that. Um, what I did last week was I actually talked about Philippians chapter 3 for the most part,
Uh,
but I kind of tied in Philippians 2 and 3 to talk about verse 21.
okay,
And when you look at that chapter, you have, the covenantal transition and contrast, but you also have the first fruit in there when you talk in Philippians 2, uh, 6 through 8. And that sets up the context of Philippians 3 and verse 21. So what I did was I just kind of touched on and laid a foundation for the first fruits to show the correlation between Colossians 1, 1 Corinthians 15 from that perspective, that you can't go anywhere in Scripture and talk about the death of Christ without talking about Christ being the first fruit.
sure,
And in those contexts, you will see that as it's established both in 1 Corinthians 15 as well as in Colossians 1 that, that's dealing with Christ dying for sin, then you have that context. And so what I thought was very important to get across was the fact that Jesus died, he came into the world and then, took on the form of man. But it's after he became a man that the text says he humbled himself, and that's the word tapenosis, which you're very familiar with in that text. And so his shame and humility was demonstrated in his suffering
yep,
and ultimately in his death. And that's the correlation between uh, Philippians 2, 7 and 8, and Philippians 3 and verse 21. But I thought it was necessary before you even get to 21 is to show from chapter 3 that covenant context, because you start dealing with circumcision in the flesh versus circumcision, in the spirit. And, that's what Paul said. We worship God in the spirit and we have no confidence in the flesh. So he's starting out that contrast, that covenantal contrast, very early on in the chapter. And it's an eschatological context as well, so you're right back into Second Corinthians chapter 3 with the transition from the ministry of death to the ministry of righteousness. And then here's Paul, saying that he counted all those things loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ and wanted to be found in him. All those are, technical terms for the
Yeah.
parousia, et cetera, being conformed unto his death, and then attaining to the resurrection out from the dead. And so I think I kind of jumped because I was running out of time as I was establishing all of that. And so by the time I think I got down to about verse 12 and discussed that and just laid that foundation of this resurrection out from the dead, then I went into Philippians verse 21 to demonstrate the correlation between that. And what was interesting is there's a text, I think it's Hosea, not Hosea, excuse me, uh, Lamentations 1, and I'm thinking verse 8, but at any rate, it talks about Israel, having undergone the captivity and the suffering for that 70 years, and or even before then, I mean, the war that put them in that condition where they are lamenting over the fact that they've lost their land, they've lost their freedom, et cetera. They're in a state of shame and humiliation. And what he uses in that text to talk about them as a corporate entity is he says that they were vile. So that text is referring to the entire nation of Israel. So there you have an old covenant context that is dealing with the same with the typology or of the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century that's connected to old covenant Israel and those coming out of that situation and being persecuted, suffering shame and being considered as a quote vile body. It's technically the body of the humiliation of us, and then having gone through that to unite them with Jesus's suffering, just like Colossians 1:24, one of your favorite
Hmm.
texts. And, so being a joint participant in that suffering, Romans 8:18 and 19, and then to enter into that glory at the parousia. And what really ties it into 1 Corinthians 15 and also in Colossians, because the same concept is there, it's in Ephesians as well, and even in Galatians. But the idea is that he mentions that all things would be subdued, that he will subdue all things to himself, and that's right back in the 1 Corinthians 15, 24 through 28, where God would be all in all, and that ties in with Colossians 3:10. So again,
Yep.
it's
Yep.
showing that relationship. So that's the angle that I went on last week, and it was an enjoyable study. I hope people got some benefit out of that, to see that all of this is really consistent. And then when you can go back in the Old Testament and find these correlations that are corporate in nature. And then I'll just say this, I sent you a quote.
Yeah.
That quote was absolutely just phenomenal, from someone who had gone back and looked at one of my videos from 2022, which, that's quite old. It was very technically, just lacking in quality because I was using a different camera. The audio was fine, but the audio and the video was all out of sync, but the message was clear.
Yeah.
And I had one of those blurred backgrounds, and I was popping in and out of reality, right? It looked like I was walking through walls, like
Hmm.
I'm walking through walls on the camera. But the guy wrote about that, and he talked
Yeah.
about how he was, an IBV guy.
Yeah.
And he said, he had looked into what, he had been teaching about Hosea chapter 6 and Hosea 13. And he saw that relationship, and he said, and even in Hosea chapter 2, he said, that's the sowing analogy.
Yep.
And it really is. It's so powerful. And he saw that, and he says, man, I've been converted.
Yeah. It was fantastic
Yeah,
testimony.
it
It
was
really
as
was.
well. Yeah, yeah. So that's the kind of thing that I really like to see in terms of people really grasping it and understanding it and seeing it for themselves and being able to articulate it so that it's not something that's coming from us. This is their own internalizing of the truths that they are studying. and they finally see it, and especially in contrast with, with something like that. So I think that's very, very cool.
Yeah, and he did express it so well. He
Yes,
expressed it succinctly,
exactly.
point by point. You could tell that he had, as you mentioned there, he had internalized it to such an extent that he wasn't regurgitating simply what you said or I said or anybody else had said. He was going, well, look, here's the connections.
Hmm.
Here's the sowing in the earth, and here's Paul, the sowing of the seed, and here's the death, here's the burial, here's the resurrection. You know, you said something there where you brought up where you got up to, um, and as you pointed out, this whole concept of upon I have trouble with that word. It's not apontesis. Ah,
Exonostasis.
no, well, not the
Oh,
out.
okay.
No,
Okay.
the one you were mentioning there in Philippians chapter 2 as the background.
Oh, tapionosis. That one.
Tapinosis. Yeah, I
Okay.
don't know. I'm still having trouble, boy, drawing up some of that stuff. It's so aggravating. But all of that is directly related, and you hinted at it there. And I loved how you go back to Lamentations. I am convinced that the book of Lamentations really provides a whole lot of echo for a lot of New Testament study and New Testament doctrine. And folks, if I were to ask for a raise of hands and to say, how many of you have read Lamentations in the last year or so? How many of you have ever really studied Lamentation uh, just to see what's there, just to really drink deeply of it? I dare say most Christians, William, would say, man, I haven't read Lamentations, in forever.
Mm.
I read it when I was reading through the Bible, but that was, way back when or whatever. But there are an awful lot of things. As a matter of fact, in my book, Who is This Babylon? I induce something like 20 or 22 echoes of Lamentations in the book of Revelation.
Hmm.
And when that hit me, William, it was like, why should I be surprised at this? If in fact the book of Revelation is about the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the Old Covenant age, then why wouldn't John, or to express it another way, why wouldn't the Spirit reflect back on the initial destruction of Jerusalem and magnify that in severity, magnify that in significance here in the book of Revelation? 586 BC was, to be sure, a traumatic event, but compared to AD 70, it paled in significance. And so as I begin to go through Lamentations and see the echoes of it in Revelation, my goodness gracious, it just absolutely blew me away. Now, as I say in the book, some of the parallels might be considered just kind of thematic parallels.
Hmm.
You have the destruction of Jerusalem here, you have the destruction of Jerusalem here. Okay, you're going to have some natural parallels, but there are some parallels that are so distinctive, not only thematically, but linguistically, that you're going, no, 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 John is drawing on Lamentations. And that helps us. It just gives more added evidence to show that Revelation really was about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Hmm.
It does it fit to describe the fall of Rome? You know, why would Christians, even in the first century, be wailing and lamenting the fall of Rome, for crying out loud? No, no. Revelation is the sorrow and the sadness and the lament all at the same time of rejoicing that the enemy was going to be overcome, they were going to receive their redemption. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, obviously, but it doesn't fit Rome when you can't even prove that Rome persecuted the church in the first century. That's a little bit troublesome. It only fits if it has a first century milieu to it. And I'm just staggered. I was watching a little bit the other day, William. Sam Frost has started a series teaching the book of Revelation.
No.
And the very first one in the series is he said, in this video, we determined what the first century saints would have understood when John said, the time is at hand. These things must shortly come to pass. And his conclusion is the time is always here because it's God's time. It's always here. And when the conclusion comes, it will come rapidly, but it's not coming anytime near soon. And I just thought, you know, and I've said this before, what what philosopher, I want to say it's Mark Twain, but somebody in the past said it's amazing what people are willing to believe when they're not willing to believe the Bible.
Mm.
And that's exactly and precisely where Sam Frost is. And I couldn't help but think. So he is taking a book written to people being persecuted, actively persecuted, dying, experiencing the loss of their goods. And they're crying out, how long, O Lord, do you not avenge us on those that are on the earth? And we have men such as Sam Frost and others as well. He's not alone, telling us that, well, God wasn't telling those people when they would be vindicated. No, no, no. He was just telling them that when the time eventually comes by and by, maybe a gazillion trillion years away, that boy, Jesus is going to ride the fastest cloud out of heaven and finally deal with the enemies, the unknown enemies of the church at that given time. Doesn't explain how they, those persecuted ones, would receive any relief from that, any comfort from that. To say, okay, give them relief and not us? How does that work? But my point being that here is John drawing from a cultural, historical circumstance and drawing from a parallel circumstance to give them comfort. And let me draw all this together in the following way. Not only does Revelation say these things must shortly come to pass, the Greek term entakai, but in Lamentation, Jeremiah said, to paraphrase this, he told us it was coming quickly, and nobody paid attention. Now, that's a rough paraphrase. But here is Jeremiah saying to Jerusalem, which is now lying in a heap, the Lord warned Jerusalem it was coming soon, it was coming quickly, it was coming shortly, but you guys didn't believe it. Well, guess what? It happened quickly, shortly, and soon.
Yeah.
And here is John repeating the same language. But according to some people, we're not supposed to believe it was going to come soon, quickly, and shortly. So those parallels are
Yeah,
incredible.
they really are. I was that verse is Lamentations 1 and verse 8 that talks about them being vile, but at the same time, it also speaks about them being naked, which, they have violated the covenant, etc. They've broken God's covenant. And so here they are going into captivity or having gone into captivity, and he associates this concept of nakedness with them. But that's also a term that is mentioned in connection with the fall of Jerusalem. So, here it is in a covenant context. So to say that, we're making up something when we use that term in reference to um, 2 Corinthians 5
Mhm.
or uh, Revelation 3, I think it is, and Revelation 16, they're both in the context of the fall of Mystery Babylon and demonstrate that imminence, but also demonstrate that, it's dealing with, the fall of Jerusalem. It's dealing with, covenantal transition and covenantal change. And it's that state of humiliation that's going on there. So, I mean, really some great parallels and, concepts between the two of them in looking at them. And of course, you had all that imminent language in what Ezekiel 7,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
The end is near over and over again.
Seven
Yeah.
times in chapter 7.
Yes.
The day of the Lord is at hand. The day of the Lord is coming soon. It will not delay. I mean, 7 times for crying out loud. And once again, we're supposed to believe that all in the world that means is just hang on, folks. It may not come anytime near soon, but boy, when it comes, I'm telling you, it's gonna happen real, real fast and real, real rapidly. William, there's another concept And I'm sure you were going to discuss it, but like you said, you were running out of time. But in Philippians chapter 3, beginning with verse 16, when Paul has already said that it was his desire to attain unto the righteousness of God
Hmm.
and to be made conformable to his death. And he says, not that we have already attained, nor are made perfect. But then he turns right around and says, but to the degree that we have attained. Paul is talking about resurrection life,
Hmm.
talking about righteousness, talking about being conformed to the image of Christ, being made conformable to his death. And he says, well, we haven't been made perfect yet. Now, if he's talking about biological death, for him, and biological resurrection, by the way, for Paul to say, well, I haven't died and been raised physically yet. Oh, come on now. As Jack Scott likes to say, that doesn't even make good nonsense at all. How silly would it be for Paul to say, now look, uh, I want to be made conformed to the physical death of Jesus Christ, and I want to be made conformable to his resurrection. Now, I haven't been conformed yet. I haven't achieved to that yet. And yet, it's something that Paul knew that he, through his righteousness, attained through faith, as he expresses very clearly in the earlier chapter, not having my own righteousness, which is through the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ. So he knew he hadn't achieved unto righteousness yet. He knew that
Hmm.
righteousness was coming at the parousia, Galatians 5:5. We, through the Spirit, eagerly await the hope of righteousness. That's what Paul was anticipating, if I'm understanding and tracking him,
Yes, and
correctly.
321 as well thrown in there.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here Paul is saying that that's our goal. We have not attained it, but we have attained it to a degree. Now, let me reemphasize, folks, if Paul's talking about biological death, biological physical resurrection, how does that work for Paul to say, I've attained that to some degree? Now, this this ties in beautifully, as you well know, and you and I have talked about this on many occasions, that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses the present passive indicative and the present active indicative. It's either 10 or 11 times, I've forgotten it precisely which, to speak of the then ongoing out from resurrection. Now, William, how does that work if Paul's discussing biological resurrection?
It just can't work. That's just not, what are you, half in the grave, half out or something? That just doesn't work at all. And yet we get so much criticism by those who complain about it being, a progressive type of process of being delivered, into this righteousness and into this covenantal concept of resurrection. But it just doesn't work with that with the concept of a physical dynamic. Even in Philippians, you have a reference to the body very early on in the chapter, because again, going back to that circumcision, when you parallel that with Colossians, um, that again has to be talking about a body that's put off, which is Romans chapter 6 and First Corinthians 15. It's all of that that's involved in that particular text, even though it's not mentioned. It's not stated emphatically, I should say, and expressly that that's what's there. But you have in the context the emphasis on putting off a body that certainly wasn't their physical body in terms of being circumcised with Christ. So the physical just doesn't work, and you wonder how long it will take for some people who look at these things on a regular basis to see that, and what is it that's causing them to even want that so much. I wonder about the motivations for people who, just as you were saying, even talking about the time, with Sam Frost, um, and denying that. And I remember, so well when you had some of your debates and they would talk about the term at hand and you would quote numbers and, 24 and show them that here he says, I'm not near. And if they say that at hand means near or means not near, what does not at hand mean?
Yeah.
So you you got all of those things that are wrapped up in that concept of nearness of the body fitting within this time frame, and yet we have the kind of pushback that we do on those things. So it's just amazing that we don't see that kind of focus on the transition that's spiritual or covenantal concept, and people want to ridicule it quite often.
And they want to individualize it.
Yes.
And that really is where a whole lot of the controversy comes in, obviously. But let's develop that a little bit and let's illustrate this. What kind of what the problem is in Romans 6, a passage that's very, very commonly understood, commonly quoted, and what have you. But notice Paul says in Romans chapter 6, verse 5, if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, we shall be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old man, now we ask a question, what is this old man here? Was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be the slaves of sin. I think I've quoted this correctly. Now, so here is Paul using this terminology of body, old man, crucifixion, and death. And he says, if we have been buried with him in the likeness of his death. Now, I know that we've talked about this before, and we mentioned this before on this program. When I debated Chris Date, I pointed out, Paul says we've been buried with him in baptism into the likeness of his death. We didn't die physically with Christ to go through a likeness of Christ's physical likeness, a physical death.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, just like that, Paul says, if we have been buried with him, we shall be raised with him in the likeness of his resurrection. Well, Chris Date says, well, the likeness of his resurrection must mean being raised from physical death. Well, if being raised in the likeness of his death means a likeness in physical resurrection, then being buried with him in the likeness of his death must mean likeness in physical death. And he goes, are you saying then that it's not the physical death? I said, well, if we don't die physically in the likeness of Christ's physical death, and since Paul says we shall be raised in the likeness of his resurrection, you can't change horses here in midstream. But let's carry that forward. So notice again that we have death, body, putting away of the old man. And putting away, he doesn't use the word flesh so much in Romans 6. But we come over here to Colossians chapter 2. And Paul says that they had been circumcised with the circumcision not made with hands. Now, there are some translations that catch the power of this a lot better than others. And there's some textual variance here. But there's strong, strong, strong textual attestation for Paul saying that you have put off the flesh. Not just, instead of saying you have put off the sins of the flesh,
Right.
as the King James says. No, there's strong textual support for the idea that Paul is saying you have put off the body of the flesh. Well, virtually every commentator that I'm aware of parallels Romans 6 with Colossians chapter 2. So when Paul says you put the old man to death, you put off the old man in baptism. Here's Paul talking about baptism, putting off the body of flesh. And then in Colossians chapter 4, how does he liken that? Put off the old man. just like Paul, Romans chapter 6. You put off the old man of sin, the old man of the body of sin. Well, then, what do we find in 1 Corinthians 15? 1 Corinthians 15, put off one body, put on another body. Put off the old man, which is corrupt. Well, Paul expresses it like this in Ephesians 4:24 and following. You have put off the old man, which is corrupt. And that's that Greek word phthora, which Paul uses in the negative, or in both senses actually, that when corruption, phthora, has put on incorruption, aphothora, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul says, you have put off the old man. Well, that old man in Romans chapter 6 is the body of sin. It's not a body of physical flesh. And so Paul is absolutely, totally consistent in his application of his terminology of body, of sin, of flesh, of corruption, of incorruption. And he says, in a text which, of course, is hotly debated, but the manuscript evidence is extremely strong. As we have borne the image of the earthy, let us bear the image of the heavenly. Well, isn't that Romans 6? The old man versus the new man? Isn't that Colossians 2? The old man, the body of flesh, versus the new man of righteousness of Ephesians chapter 4, the old man which is corrupt according to deceitful lust, and the new man which is created after the image of the one who created him. Well, that image of the one who created him is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, having borne one image to bear the other image, all in the context of walking after the precepts and the law and the spirit of Christ. None of it has to do with biological flesh of a physical old man. And so the point that we're getting at here is in Philippians chapter 3, 2 and 3, where Paul is contrasting Jesus's humiliation and the humiliation of the body. And he talks about being transformed into the or after the image of the one who created them, or by the same power of the one that transformed him. It's all one consistent narrative throughout all of these texts. Paul is not jumping from a discussion of biological, physical bodies to spiritual, pneumatic bodies.
Mm-hmm.
No, he's talking about people walking after the image of Christ, obeying Christ, walking in his word, living as to use his terminology, walking in the spirit versus walking in the flesh in a way contrary to the will of God. And when we insert, and this gets back to the question that you asked, how long will it be before people catch on to the fact that Paul's not focusing on individual biological bodies here? He is focused on a body of humiliation that was going through a transitional period of time to be transformed into the image of God's dear Son. Romans 8 enters into this extremely well, obviously. And so, to reiterate the point, it's a united narrative in all of these texts. Now, it's necessary, I think, at this juncture. William, tell me if I'm wrong on this. I know you and I have discussed it. You cannot have a corporate without individuals comprising the corporate. Okay? But people want to focus strictly on the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And they become egocentric in a way. That, well, if you're saying Jesus did not die for me personally, then you're negating Christ's sacrifice for me. Well, let's see. Acts chapter 20 and 28. Here is one of the clearest texts of a corporate work of Christ. Christ loved us, Paul said, and he purchased the church, that's the corporate body, with his own blood. And William, I don't really know of anybody that denies that that's a corporate reality, right?
It definitely is.
Okay. And yet Paul could say, after writing that or speaking that in Acts chapter 20 and 28, in Galatians chapter 2, I do not live by walking after the flesh, but after the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me.
Hmm.
And people run over there and they say, oh, see, Paul said Christ died for him. Well, of course he died for him. How did Christ die for Paul? Because Paul had become a member of the body of Christ, which Christ died to purchase with his own blood. It's not a severe either or, and it's not a dichotomization. Well, if you say Christ died for the church, then you're saying he didn't die for me.
Hmm.
No, I didn't say that. We're all members, though there be many members, yet there is but one body. The one body is that which for which Jesus died. And I hope all of that made some sort of sense. I would say it's a drug-induced statement, but I'm not taking any more drugs. So,
Yeah, I mean, if even if you think about a legal entity like a corporation, and if it's a company, it can be UPS, it can be FedEx. If it comes, I'm thinking of the background that I came out
okay.
of, but you've got a single entity, which is that corporate body. And of course, it has a head, but it's a separate legal entity. And then you have those who are members of that entity. They become a part through enrollment or being hired, etc., and they come under certain covenant obligations that they have to keep in order to remain employed and to remain benefiting from that. And what the company will do is they will enact something like a group health plan. They may have a stock options plan or 401k plan and several other benefits in terms of the corporate profits that apply to everyone. So if you're in that company, uh, you automatically get the health benefits of that company just by virtue of the fact that you are there. So it's not ignoring you as an individual, but it's not your individual policy, necessarily. You do have individual rights to it because you have joined yourself to it, and you go the fate of the company as far as that goes. And even from the perspective of a retirement, it's because the company has a retirement program that you get the opportunity to participate in it. And so you can have that individual benefit of what the company has produced. And at the same time, the company is larger than any individual. And certain things that, it participates in, you get the benefit of it by being a member of it. So I think people should kind of study that a little bit more, and they will see, some definite correlations between the church as a corporate entity and how individuals operate within it, and the blessings that become, everyone who is in the, in the body. And so that will demonstrate that we're not saying, exclude one. Now, if you're outside and you never become an employee of a legal entity of that corporation, then you can't go around and say, I'm going to the hospital and, I want to attach this bill to your to your corporate plan. That's not going to work. And after you work, for 20 years or 25 years, you go there and say, okay, I'm ready to draw down my retirement. It doesn't work that way. You got to be a part of that organization in order for you to experience those benefits. I also want to go back to the idea that you were building on in Romans chapter 6 when you were talking about you know uh, the body and the transition from the body and the nature of the body, etc. Well, there's another concept there, and that is the fact that when you're talking about the death of Christ, they are planted together
Yeah,
with him,
yeah.
into this death, which is a sowing of them.
Absolutely.
Now, think about this. They're not placed in the ground to be sown. And the other aspect, people tell us that, oh, you're drawing out Paul's seed analogy too far. He didn't mean that. Well, what did he mean in Romans chapter 6 when those who were sown were not physically dead? You see, you can't sow dead seed and expect for it to, to grow and to sprout. And yet, as you were saying, it was a corrupt uh, body and relationship, in that corporate entity. And then when they're raised in righteousness. That's a whole different body that's going on there. But the other part of that is they were sown alive. And I'm not talking about their physicality as far as being sown alive. They were alive to sin. And Paul actually says that in the
Yeah.
chapter. And then, having been sown into Jesus' death, they die to sin and are raised to righteousness. They're raised to a new body. That's where that transition comes from. So you can't uh, claim the seed analogy in Romans chapter 6 and then understand also that it's not focused on physicality or something that you would call mortal. And it also demonstrates very clearly that corruption and mortality, because if it's subject to death, there is certainly a death in Romans chapter 6.
Yep.
Well, that fits the description of mortal and corruptible, etc. So that also disproves the idea that you can only be talking about something physical when you use the terms mortal and corruptible. So it just doesn't work. It's disproven right there in Romans chapter 6. And in like manner, even if you're talking about the dead ones, they would have to be alive to something as well. And I would see that as they're being alive to sin, according to Hebrews 9:15, because it was for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first covenant. And therefore, they would have to, that same gospel, that same death would have to be for their transformation and transition out of sin and being raised into the body of Christ, like Hebrews 11:39 and 40 says, these all died not having received the promise, but God having provided something better for us, that they, apart from us, should not be made perfect. And that takes you right back to that Philippians concept of being made perfect that you were talking about. So it's right there in the scriptures. And, you're fighting against yourself. You're arguing on the one hand, it's physical for 1 Corinthians 15 that they can only apply to that, which is just not correct. And then you'll go right to Romans and you're forced by context, by the language. There's no way you can argue for physical death unless you want somebody to shovel dirt over you for your baptism or dying with Christ. It just won't work.
Yeah, and there are other texts in which this is brought out ever so powerfully. Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 20, God is faithful. If we confess him, he will confess us. If we deny him, he will deny us. And then he said something very, very powerful. We believe that if we died with him, we shall also live with him. Well, that's just a statement of Colossians chapter 3. If then you were buried with Christ, or if you died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. Well, that theme, that's Romans chapter 6. That's Colossians chapter 2. That's in so many of the Pauline epistles. But nobody is going to argue that when Paul said, this is a faithful saying, if we died with him, we shall live with him, that he's talking biological life and death.
Mm-hmm.
Or for that matter, unfortunately, this is precisely what happens. They say, well, this is a faithful saying. If we died spiritually with Christ, we will live physically with him. And so they change hermeneutic right there in the very same verse. Instead of seeing that the life that was coming was the direct antithesis of the death that they were experiencing or that they had experienced, they interject two different lives or two different deaths or whatever into the text. And once again,
And that means Christ is two kinds of first fruits, right?
well, it has to mean that. I mean, you can't avoid that implication of Christ being the first fruits of two different kinds of life, two different kinds of death, which obviously doesn't work very
Right.
well at all. And so there, it becomes almost a mishmash, it seems to me, William, of people that they don't look for an overarching, unifying theology of death and life. They become, as I mentioned earlier, a few moments ago, they become so egocentric and they become so focused on physical life that that's all that they can see. And I'm reminded of one particular commentary on the book of John, uh, the commentator by the name of Hoskins, and he was just simply stating what is the basically the common view. Here is
Hmm.
Jesus in John chapter 5, 24 and following. The hour is coming, and now is, in which the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of Man. And he said, if any man believes in the one who sent me, he has passed from life, from death to life. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all that are in the grave shall come forth. So Hoskins goes, now it's obvious, he says, that in verse 24, 25, 26, Jesus is talking about spiritual death, being spiritually dead, hearing the voice of the gospel, being converted to Christ, obeying the gospel, and being raised out of spiritual death. However, verse 28 and 29, now all of a sudden he shifts gears, changes subject dramatically. Now he's talking about people in literal physical graves, people who then are able to hear this voice. And I don't know how a dead person can hear a voice, but nonetheless, uh, these biologically dead, decomposed people in the graves hear the voice of Jesus, and they come out. They receive reconstituted, restored, resurrected bodies, and they go to heaven. That's clearly physical, Hoskins says. And that, as you well know, that's the most common view of John chapter 5. Instead of seeing that Jesus was talking about a process that was being initiated in his personal ministry, and that is the call and the herald, the invitation to life. And some were already beginning to accept that and looking forward to the consummation of that at the end of the age, the judgment, and the resurrection, into which in which all would participate. And so instead of seeing, to reiterate here, resurrection initiated, resurrection consummated, which is Revelation 20, they see two radically different kinds of death, two radically different kinds of resurrection. And once again, guess what happens? The church, the corporate body, gets put into the background. It loses its role in the eschaton. It
Hmm.
seems to me that that's what's happening, at least, because the entire focus is placed on the individual coming out of the grave. And so people say, and I'll ask you to respond to this, people say, oh, what you're saying there then, Preston, is that Paul must have believed that the church was dead. How can you say that the church was dead, especially based on Romans chapter 6? Is that what I'm saying? Is that what Paul was saying, more importantly? Was Paul saying the church was dead and waiting to be raised out of the dead?
No, fir- first and foremost, we have to follow Christ in terms of resurrection because it's through him, as you know, we've been talking about, being the first fruit from the dead. And so what you have is the raised Christ. And then you have, and he's the body of Christ to begin with. And that I think is also a part of what people miss is the fact that take for example a text like Romans 12 and verse 13. It says, for by one spirit are we all baptized into one body. Well, who's that one body that everybody's baptized into? It has to be there in order for them to enter into the one body. And so from that perspective, you have individuals coming into the body and beginning to partake of that life through the spirit at the time and transferring into that life. And so it's a process. Yes, they are dying to the old, but they're at the same time making that transition, as you mentioned, with the present active, present passive verbs that are demonstrated there.
Yeah. And I like personally, I like Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23. Paul is talking about husband and wife relationships. And he says the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the savior of the body. Well, just about done for the evening. Paul is in this one very, very power packed, yet succinct statement is telling us where individual salvation is found. It is found in the corporate body of Christ.
Right.
And so I think we can just leave it right there. We're out of time. Great to be back. Just about done my due for the evening. And thank you again, William, for filling in so well for me during my downtime. I hope I'm done with this. I'm ready to be done with it, believe you me.
I hear you.
So, folks, thank you so very much for being with us here on Two Guys in the Bible, a voice you can trust. And with that, I'll say good evening.
Good evening.
All right. Thank you, William. Good. That was a good show, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And you seemed like your voice got stronger as you went on. So I was a
Well,
little worried at first, but
it did for a little bit, and then it started tapering off.
yeah.
No, but anyway. All right, man. Good night.
Okay, okay, good night.